When I was young, I flew to the U.S. Virgin Islands with a friend. It was really exciting, and we got into a playful argument about whether or not the water below us, being the ocean, was blue or green. Well, of course, it was probably a combination of the two, but I really didn't have any color knowledge at that time. I didn't have the vocabulary it would take to say what colors we were actually seeing. Well, as it turns out, this is very typical. People don't always have the description of color that makes sense to someone else. So this first class is all about the terminology of color. I'm going to give you the terminology to use when working with other UX designers, when working with developers, with trainers, with people who don't have a lot of color information. In fact, there's no guarantee that we all name the colors we see the same way. We also grossly generalize our color names to include a variety of similar colors, making communication about color very difficult. There's nothing new about this. You buy a brown shirt and a brown pair of pants, and they don't match. These happen to work well together, but the colors aren't the same even though they're both called brown. Paint manufacturers create new names for their paint colors. Their colors' names are very descriptive and probably have an impact on how we emotionally respond to a color sample. Sometimes a color name is steeped in history. Prussian Blue, for instance, was developed back in the 18th century and was used to dye the fabric of Prussian Blue army uniforms. Over time, the pigment was renamed to Berlin, Parisian, and Turnbull's Blue. There was even a Crayola crayon named Prussian Blue. But in 1958, the name was changed to Midnight Blue. Why? We aren't sure. The American Chemical Society mentions on its website that Midnight Blue might have been a more politically correct name given the Cold War taking place at the time. Or perhaps people couldn't identify with the name Prussia anymore, and a more modern name simply helped people identify the dark blue pigment. We'll probably never know. A color called Tyrian Purple symbolized royalty and nobility as early as 1600 BC through the mid-1400s. At times there were even laws stating that common people were not allowed to wear purple. Only members of royal families could wear purple. Tyrian purple, considered by historians to be the first purple dye, was derived from a small mollusk. It could only be manufactured in a region of the Mediterranean Sea close to what we now call Lebanon. It took over 9,000 mollusks to create 1 gram of Tyrian purple. Well, only the richest social classes could afford such luxuries. And because the ancient emperors, kings, and queens were often considered to be gods or descendants of gods, purple took on a religious significance that continues in some religions today. Ellen Conroy, a historian, wrote a book called The Symbolism of Colors in 1921. In that book, she described colors as having both positive and negative connotations. Each color, she said, was associated with a positive message sourced from some aspect of life or religion, and an equally negative message sourced from some other aspect of a social belief or observation. For instance, the color blue is associated with both truth and sadness. Blue is another color that, when it was first created, was so expensive and rare that it took on colossal significance. If you study Christian art, you'll learn that the color blue was most often used to depict Mary, the mother of Jesus. Other sources tell us that blue is associated with truth, as in the phrase true blue, because the sky is blue on a calm and clear day. Apparently that color of sky encourages us to reflect on life, and it's that calm reflection that leads to truth. Well, that's an interesting concept. On the flip side, blue can also convey sadness and despair. If you've got the blues, you're sad or depressed. I'm not sure how blue took on that connotation, but water is frequently thought of as being blue, and Zeus made it rain when he was sad, according to Greek mythology. Ellen Conroy's book goes on to say that green represents either nature and wisdom, or it represents jealousy. Or in our society, green means money or go. Yellow can mean either happiness or being a coward or being deceitful. In our modern world, white can mean purity or death, depending on where you are in the world. Americans most often wear white wedding gowns. In India, traditional wedding gowns are red. Why wear something that symbolizes death on your wedding day? As user experience professionals, how are we supposed to know which way people are going to interpret the colors we use when there are opposite meanings associated with many colors? And it gets worse when we look at the names of colors. To understand that issue, look at crayons. Yeah, crayons. It was the creation of those discrete, stepped colors that challenged the names of colors in different societies. Remember my plane flight to the Caribbean many years ago? Blue and green? Those colors were mixing in those waters of the Caribbean, and they have a very interesting history. In fact, they've been named in very different ways across time and across cultures. In Japan, one word, spelled AO, describes both blue and green up until around the year 1000. Then a new Japanese word, Midori, came into being and described something close to the greenish end of blue. That was the first distinction between blue and green in the Japanese language. Other ancient languages also had words that could either mean blue or green, including Thai, Korean, Vietnamese, and Chinese. Then, in 1917, crayons were first introduced to Japan, and crayons had two separate colors, one for blue and one for Midori. As young students were taught in schools with the use of those crayons, the instructional materials they were given taught them to distinguish between the blue and the green. Modern Japanese language now distinguishes between the two colors, but there are still cultures and languages in the world that don't differentiate at all between blue and green, so humans are still grappling with the process of differentiating and naming colors. Color is undoubtedly a very complex issue with contextual, physical, and perceptual branches of understanding. By the time you finish this course, you will have definitive ways of dealing with digital color, and you'll also have a greater depth of understanding when it comes to choosing and building color schemes, and then testing those colors with your end users. To get started, I want to introduce you to a color language that removes any ambiguity associated with the names of colors.